Lots of comments from everyone on their way in. When I went out to say it's time to start coming in, someone said, "Oh no, we're not too scary, huh?" It's my privilege to welcome you to the Mind Body Wellness Center. We've been a part of Leadville Medical Center and the community of Leadville since 1997. We're here to serve both your preventive and wellness needs, and it's our privilege to interact with you every opportunity we can. I have to take an opportunity to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Kathy Berkey. She has been with Mind Body Wellness Center about 8.5 years. She earned her doctorate and finished up her residency and became a licensed psychologist during that time. And she's here to share with you some of the recent interests that she's had and a growing concern among our population. Dr. Kathy Berkey.
Well, I'm pretty informal, and I'd like this to be somewhat informal, but there's so much to present that I know I'm just going to kind of blow through that. Jamie is going to hand out just some of the basic handouts that I want to give to you, so you don't have to write if you want to know some of these things. With as many people as came or signed up, decided not to do all these PowerPoint slides because a lot of them are just pictures, and then I'll talk to you. So if there's anything that you want after this that isn't included in those handouts, you can let me know. But I certainly welcome you here. I hope we can learn a lot of things in a short amount of time in a topic that we could probably be here until midnight, I think. Now, I have no idea why you've come, what brings you here, but I would imagine that in some way your life, as all of ours have been, has been touched by self-absorption. And even though that's sometimes hard to define, we could talk about how is that lived out in somebody's life. When you think about self-absorption, many times we all exhibit some of those characteristics and tendencies, don't we? Yeah. How many think that we're becoming more self-absorbed? And we'll talk about that in a minute, because that would be an interesting discussion for an hour that we don't really have time for. But how do we identify the way that self-absorbed people come across interpersonally? That's that's the greatest effect, whether it's at home, whether it's somebody you're married to, whether it's somebody you're dating, whether it's somebody you work with, or if you're a parent. So we're going to talk about all those different relationships and how it's lived out a little bit, and just kind of skim across the top. I think about wetting your whistle. Just give you a little bit to think about, and then more of this can be pursued some other time. But it is, and I'm just keeping my notes in front of me because I have attention deficit disorder, unmedicated. So I have to keep myself in line, and I do that with PowerPoint and notes. Otherwise, I could get off on all kinds of tangents and tell all kinds of stories that are interesting, but they take too long. I gave you a handout on some annoying behaviors of people that are self-absorbed. It can be anything from impatience in traffic, that would be moi, or it could be just the way you talk to people, the way you are interested only in what you're interested in, and if I change the topic to talk about something I'm interested in, you're going to glaze over. Just little things, because we can all look at ourselves, and I believe that we all ought to look at ourselves on a pretty much day-to-day basis and say, wait a minute, do these things apply to me? I have often said that one of my greatest fears is that these disorders apply to me, and no one will tell me. I'm uninformed because they just don't have the guts to tell me. One of the greatest skills that we can all have is self-awareness and self-observation, of being able to stand back and say, you know what, I need to pay attention to this. Maybe I'm a little bit more self-absorbed than I thought. If you are doing that, and if you ask yourself a question, am I self-absorbed, am I narcissistic, you're not as bad as you could be because you're at least asking the question. What we'll find out is that people who are on the farthest end of that scale almost never ask that question, and they have almost no insight into it whatsoever. So we will talk about that. But on that first handout, just little behaviors that have to do with self-absorption. These really are at the lower end of the scale. Everything, everywhere from slightly annoying and self-absorbed, all the way up to what we're going to focus the most on, and that's going to be narcissism. How many of you are familiar with a definition of narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder? Yeah, we all pretty much know what that is. But I want to look at it. I want to take us to that end of the scale and primarily focus on that so that we understand what is this animal that we're talking about. What probably concerns us the most is when we run into people who are on that farthest end of that perspective, or on that spectrum. And let's see, just in terms of time. Oops, that's not it. Hit the wrong button. When you live with someone or interact with them, how do we identify what are the greatest problems that exhibit themselves when you get to the kind of abnormal thinking, abnormal behaving, abnormal processing in attitudes, beliefs, behaviors that characterize narcissism? When we think about it being on the rise, is there anybody here who thinks it isn't on the rise? Because it's okay. How many of you are not sure? Yeah, it's hard to tell. And interestingly enough, the research disagrees here and there on whether it is or whether it isn't on the rise. There are people who, for instance, in this book, The Narcissism Epidemic, really what they're saying is they used a measure of narcissism and said that since the 1980s, it has, in a sense, exploded among younger people. And we could think, what are some of the contributing factors to that? It might be Facebook, it might be selfies, it might be... How many of you think that the current generation, the younger generation, is more self-absorbed than earlier generations? And then I could say, well, how old are you? Because the younger generation might not think that. I think more popular belief seems to be that there is an increase in that and that the younger generation is more self-absorbed. Why do you think that? Anybody want to offer a couple of comments on what makes you think that?
Well, I think the addiction to the cell phones. If you're in a classroom situation, it is, unless you say you cannot have your cell phones out, it is almost impossible to reach students.
Okay.
And if you tell them that they can't, they have very unique ways of being able to text from their pocket, which is phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
I think with a lot of things, it seems like just with the media today and everything being there from texting and Facebook and selfies and Twitter, I think just the ability to see people's level of self-absorption is there that wasn't there in the past.
And what is conveyed in the media? What are the images that they're seeing? What's being projected as how life is and how it ought to be?
That kind of leaves the kid to themselves to find something for themselves, which I think think that just brings more of a disconnection.
And there are any number of things that we could talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the work ethic is, with our youth is declined and the sense of entitlement is increased,
Okay.
leading to more of a me generation.
Okay. There has been some conjecture that the breakdown of the family, the breakdown of religious institutions, and I look at that and I think, where did I learn about others? Sunday school, things like that. And I can remember when I was growing up, even when you talk about changes in parenting. I know I'm old, but I also think that we have a breakdown in parenting. Part of it is parents are busy. Are they always legitimately busy? Not so much. We now have a generation of parents that are pretty self-absorbed, and their attention paid to their children in that parenting isn't there. And when we think about one of the things that is very key to someone not becoming so self-absorbed and not becoming so narcissistic is empathy, the ability to walk in somebody else's shoes, to feel what they feel. And I can remember my mother, and I was young, taking me by the face, young, and saying to me, do you understand how somebody else might feel in this situation? And as a child, I thought, no, and I'm not sure that I care. But as a parent, she taught me to think about somebody else's perspective by taking me by the chin and making me think that through. Now, that's one of a million times that parenting occurred from one or the other of my parents to make me take that perspective of somebody else. I read a statistic that there is a direct correlation between the number of friends somebody has on Facebook and the level of narcissism. How many people? And sadly enough, I remember talking to a woman who was getting a divorce, and she said, my husband has 300 friends on Facebook, not one of which he can pick up the phone and call and say, this is where I'm at. And if you have 500 friends on Facebook, what does that necessarily mean? But for younger generations, what does that mean? And what do we do on Facebook? We put our best experiences, we put our best pictures, we put the self that we project many times on Facebook is our best self. And then what do our 150 to 500,000 friends do? I like it. I got 97 likes on that picture that I put on there. What is that doing? We don't know yet. It's just, we have no idea where all of that is going. But when we think about how these things develop, there are any number of theories of how it happens, and I'll come back to that. Just real quickly, when we think about people, our personalities develop over time. Obviously, we are a combination. How that's all taken place can be genetics, it can be environment, it can be temperament, personality. I know my niece, I have two situations that come to mind that have been excellent experiences for me on a very personal level. I have a very good friend who is 10 years older than me or so, who was deeply, deeply wounded in childhood. And I have watched this lived out in his life all the years that I've known him. And you'll find him here in a little bit when I talk about people who become narcissistic out of pain and abuse and rejection and neglect. Others become, I'm getting ahead of myself, so I won't. My niece is currently in the process of a divorce from a man who has an IQ of 154, and he will tell you that as often as you will listen to him tell you. And there isn't quite anybody on earth except those who belong to Mensa who would really understand him. And he has said to her, I'm sorry that you cannot live up to my expectations. And it has deeply wounded her being in a relationship with him for 14 years. His children, he thought that was going to make him happy 8 years ago when they started having kids, and they have 2. But that's not made him happy either, and that's on down the line too. But I can talk about that. They don't even live in the state. But she's raising 2 boys, one of which, the 5-year-old, is so much like his father in temperament and personality that she knows she's going to have to work very hard with that younger one to teach him empathy, because she can see it already. And if we don't catch this stuff early, the longer and the farther it goes, the harder it is to make any changes. Yes? Yes, I believe that we can. And part of it is to adults if they want to know. It's very hard to teach even if they do want to know, because this is hardwiring stuff. And some people have a hard time with it just because they were born that way. It's just hard for them to understand where somebody else is coming from. And that's why I'm a firm believer in let's do something about the hard wiring when people are younger to try to catch this early. Whether it's urging, parents to come back and learn these skills themselves. How can you model something for your children that you don't know how to do yourself? You're not. You can't. Schools can't do it. They're trying. They're trying in anti-bullying campaigns and things like that to combat this stuff. But primarily it's got to be done on a day-to-day basis in the environment the child's in for a long period of time. But it's a challenge to all of us to think, how can we intervene? How can we make this better for children? But we are all a combination, obviously, of all these positive and negative personality traits. In psychology, we've talked about the big 5 personality factors. And these are just basic dimensions of personality that go together to make us who we are. And there is a range on each one of these. And our behavior comes out of the combination of how these things go together. Oops, I hit the wrong one every time. The first one is openness, and it's just curiosity, creativeness, openness to new ideas, and it can be anywhere from openness to closed. We're going to find ourselves somewhere on there. And you can look all this stuff up online. That's what I love about the internet. That's the part I love. Conscientiousness, organized, systematic, achievement-oriented, extroversion, anywhere from introversion to extroversion, where people are sociable, they enjoy social situations. I am basically an introvert. People don't necessarily always believe that, but I am, I always have been, I always will be. Agreeableness, sometimes that's just what it says. A cigar is just a cigar. You're just agreeable, more tolerant, more sensitive, more trusting. This is on one end of the scale, and the other end are the opposite of these things. Neuroticism, anxious, irritable, temperamental. So when you put all these combinations of things together in these big 5 personality factors, it becomes who we are. And when we think about children, I listen to, when we talk about personality disorders, on this end of the scale, as we put our personality traits together, we could develop what has been in the past called a personality disorder. So that in our diagnostic manual, which I have mixed thoughts about, because at our very best we are labeling things, the best that we know. Do we really understand it? We understand it about this well. When I was first in school, which was 100 years ago, the diagnostic manual, it was the DSM-2, that's how old I am. It was about that thick, it was about that big. I mean, you could read it in 2 hours. Not so much anymore. Now, this means that we do understand things better, but we also it just gets deeper and more complex as we go. So trying to understand personality disorders, there are various personality disorders. Narcissistic personality disorder is the extreme end of self-absorption, to make it simple. And it's an enduring pattern. This begins, you can see patterns of it developing in late adolescence, early adulthood, and it becomes a kind of an inflexible way of dealing with the world. Many times it is borne out in the most negative ways in interpersonal social interaction. That's where we see it. That's where the greatest pain comes out. If I lived all by myself, I could be as crazy as I wanted to be, and it wouldn't affect anybody. But this is a social world. Typically leads to distress or impairment. Now, I heard somebody speak, and I thought it was great, talking about the diagnostic manual and talking about personality disorders because they've talked about maybe eliminating that category. It helps us understand things, but it is, after all, just a category. And one of the things that I liked about what this guy said was, many children grow up in homes that are neglectful, abusive. The parenting is at best sporadic, unpredictable, and they have to what? They have to survive. So they learn how to cope, one way or the other. And we just have to fly by the seat of our pants sometimes as children. I was fortunate not to have to do that.